Hi, this is Privateer Station, and today we bring you day 756 of Russian war with Ukraine. As always, with former advisor to the Office of the President of Ukraine, Lieutenant Colonel Alexei Arestovich, and Ukrainian journalist Nikolai Feldman. Today they go deeper into the issues underlying problems in the Ukrainian army and the global situation out in Europe and the United States. Our special thanks go to Out There and Clever Pittsburgh. Thank you for your kind support. We do appreciate that. Everybody else, please also do not forget to click the like button and subscribe if you have not done that. That really helps us. Or consider becoming a member. With this, let's go deep dive into day 756. Enjoy. Hello everybody, this is Project Alpha. My name is Nikolai Feldman. You are watching War Diary with Alexei Arestovich. Hello Alexei, good evening everybody. Alright, let's start with the situation on the front. We have a lot of news related to European publications, and it's important to comment what's happening on the front. I think the situation there is generally stable this week, but there are several concerns being risen by a bunch of observers on Kurakhovo direction. Anything you would want to comment on this? How dangerous it is? All right, look, they have a task to cut off the Vuhledar protrusion and to get to Kurakhovo area to push our troops away from their logistics and to create condition when the front line allows them to push deeper and further than what they're doing right now. They're actually talking about connecting two different groups, one coming from Avdeevka, the other going up from south. So joining these two, or at least creating some pressure on both flanks of our troops, that's what they're going for. And one of the smaller tasks here is that they're pushing our troops further from Volnovakha, because from Vuhledar to Volnovakha, from one center to another, to the railroad station, railroad junction is about 36 kilometers where long-range artillery can easily reach, and they several times were hit rather successfully. So they're trying to exert some effort here. They're using a similar concept to what we are doing. They're trying to pull us apart in different sides of the front. It's a blinking offensive, so to say. Something blinks here, we run to shut it down. Something blinks further out, we run there. And then find a good moment when they can concentrate their reserves and make another active attack, active incursion somewhere. So this is one of the tactics and efforts that they're using. This is a multi-factor story. And the problem is not only near Kurakhovo. They also continue pressing near Robotina. They still attack Krynki with all they have. They have basically became the second Donetsk airport, or seventh Donetsk airport, depends how you count. I think everybody who is fighting there on our side should be given a Hero of Ukraine award, because with their smaller numbers they're holding, I wouldn't even say how much they're holding now, but they're roughly keeping 2.5 Russian divisions in that area, plus minus. Otherwise, these forces would be fighting in a different place somewhere and would have become a more serious factor on any other direction, let's say on the same Robotina, for example, to add additional advantage and to continue pressing us to retreat. So many people are saying, what is the meaning of those military raids of Russian Volunteer Corps and Legion Freedom of Russia and Siberia into the Russian territory? Since they started those incursions to fight on the territory of Russia proper, the activity near Kupiansk went down significantly because they withdrew a bunch of resources to be redirected on themselves, including artillery and aviation. So they're not aiding their troops near Kupiansk. They are actually making life much easier for our troops to defend in the northeast part of the front. They continue to press really hard on Avdeevka. Their plans on Svatovo has not disappeared. They still have plans on Liman as well. So generally in the direction of Belgorovka, they continue their pressure. It's more of a positional fighting right now, but still they have the same ideation. They have the same plans to get from Bakhmut to Chasiv Yar. They're trying to push there to get to the hills. And the fight near Kurdyumovka and Andreevka still ensues. It's very active. But they continue to press very actively. At the bottom near Avdeevka, this is probably one of the hotter, as you mentioned. So we understand their general ideation. They want to get to Donetsk, so to say, and to create conditions for further advancement towards Konstantinovka, towards Kramatorsk and Slavyansk agglomeration. Here they are on the map, but it doesn't mean that they'll get there soon, tomorrow, or if they will even get there at all, because our troops are also exerting enough effort to preclude them from advancing. However, if we have people from Donetsk and their whereabouts listening to us, I understand this mentioning of their town actually did probably raise their eyebrows and cause them to concern. But yeah, it's not in the near immediate future. So yeah, there was more data about Russians using aerial gliding bombs. There were about 480 explosions in the recent times. Right, they indeed, Nikolai, are using a lot of those bombs on our territory, and they're trying to attack Sumy region, to somewhat asymmetrically attack us in different places, to cause us to maybe cancel the Russian Volunteer Corps and Legion Freedom of Russia activities. And they're not picking their targets, they're dropping them where they can. There was some crazy numbers in how much they dropped during a week. They were very different numbers brought by different analysts, and they are very, very significantly different. But still, these are huge bombs, and it's Putin's attempt to lead asymmetric warfare, to force us withdraw our troops from other parts of the front, so we would be covering our northern border as well. One can only say that Ukraine is in a very uncomfortable position because we have Russia surrounding us from 5/6 of our territory, of our border, and we only have the western border from Moldova to tip of Belarus over there, where we're not surrounded by Russians, to about Brest. Everything else is we have to face Russian troops. So it means we have to be equally strong, or at least somewhat strong, along all those 5/6 of the border, holding a lot of troops both in the south and up in the north, to make sure we have enough to rally when we need to, if we need to. And they have a chance to choose out of 2,000 borderline or front line now on the ground. It gives them an option to choose where to attack. So the idea, Alexei, to guard the border with Belarus and Moldova and the West with the NATO troops. Did anything change during the last 7 days in this regard? No, we are not facing that probability yet, but Russia was warned by different measures that its attempt to start a new conflict or a new war, or the same war in a new direction, according to our predictions, Baltic countries, Moldova, Baltic Sea, will be met by direct introduction by the army of NATO, in this case, intervention. And a key element here is that EU is ready to act even without US support in this regard. So the statements made by Trump and the statement made by Putin brought EU in a very uncomfortable situation, and a lot of analysts, including myself, are thinking that EU will probably fold and fret and will not stand up to that challenge, but turned out to be different. EU, led by Macron in this case, shrugged their shoulders, and they're moving a lot of troops to the eastern border towards Russia, Belarus border with Ukraine as well. And a lot of these troops will be moved there to remain. So it is a strategic deployment of NATO troops, masked as a training exercise, disguised as an exercise. Overall numbers quoted by a Polish general is about 300,000 we should remind that Russia has about 600,000 troops here in Ukraine on the front. They don't have too much left on the Russia proper territory, and that's a serious argument. 300,000 of NATO soldiers, a half of Russian current group, is a very serious deterrent. And EU and NATO don't even need to actively engage anything, but that's a significant message to Russia that if they try to expand their area of activities, they will likely be confronted and actively confronted by the forces of NATO. Russia, if we remind our viewers, listeners, that they were planning to intervene a little bit into NATO territory somewhere, maybe Baltic countries, maybe Moldova, somewhere in that area, and they would want NATO to sit down at the table as a result of it, to force them to dwindle and diminish their aid to Ukraine. But it didn't fly, and that's fantastic news for us. That blackmail is not working, and NATO is preparing. The head of the command of French army said that French army is ready. He made an estimate that, Pierre Schild made an estimate that French army has enough forces that are well-trained, that are operatively compatible with armies of allies. And he made that statement via the article in Le Monde, the head of Central Command of France. He said that the world order, where negotiations are the key element to resolve conflicts, has failed. And the actions on the borders of our continent outline not only about escalation of war, but about the presence of war as a constant factor to conflict resolution. And that actually sounds really close to what you were saying, Alexei, during the last 4 months about the new world order and about the need to legalize and bring back out of the shadows the war as a technology for resolving conflicts. So this idea is now being realized and being voiced by the head of the Central Command of France. So in your view, when these ideas become mainstream, presented by these high-level figures, what does it mean? Well, for the civilians, it probably sounds like a nightmare, rehabilitation of war, right? But on the other hand, we have 2 generations who have grown in a liberal school of geopolitics, liberal worldview that wars are an abnormality and that you can spend a lot of effort to maintain peace. But in realistic point of view that Putin practices, and let's say Republican and or the right in the United States and other places also see that the similar way that war is normal. It's part of a political process. Wars are constant, just like football championships. It is a very uncomfortable piece of news for those people who are brought up in the paradigm that nothing will happen, and those people who have destroyed their armies thinking about that paradigm, that wars are impossible, especially for Ukraine as well. But one needs to understand that wars are normal, in quotes, of course. They're horrible, but they're still remaining, and I suspect they will be remaining an instrument of politics, one of the instruments till the second coming. And wars will be happening, they were happening, they will continue happening, especially with the countries who think they will never be fighting. For example, Ukraine. I remember all these conversations. Who needs us, right? Why do we need that army? Why are we spending so much money on defense? So one needs to understand that we will be fighting, not only this war, but several other wars as well. During the lifespan of everybody who is listening to us, there'll probably be several wars, and this is normal in quotes. There is nothing normal in wars, right? But it is a normal tool of politics, unfortunately. And what happened is that after the Second World War, after all the nightmares and atrocities of that, all politicians of the world, having read a small article by Kant that birthed the idea of modern geopolitics and liberalism view on that it's possible to arrange it in a fashion that wars will never be, because wars are ineffective. And that's what Kant is writing there, because if people had a choice, they would not be fighting because it's not profitable. I want to say that there's nothing rational in geopolitics. Inspiration for geopolitics comes usually from irrational. Napoleon was asked once, where does he birth the plans for his wars from? You know what he said? He answered that I'm building the plans for the future wars out of the dreams of my sleeping soldiers. Even he understood back then that it's irrational that guides that. You can package it later logically. You can say that you need that flank, that it's difficult with that strait, you need to be there, or it's too close for the missile flight time. But it's only about a third of human behavior, especially if we're talking about masses, only if it is curated as well. Because if you take a country like Ukraine, we really do not like the rational part. One of the main crimes one can do in the public sphere is to be rational. So most of these conflicts are calculated via irrational vector. And I would say that, soon when AI will be taking over a bunch of things, human part will remain in the world of irrational. That's our contribution to the world. So all of these wars, all of this global politics, they're often based on irrational. Look, two people, just like people, will always find common language. And that creates a dangerous illusion that two people, as representatives of two symbolic sacred capitals, will also find a common language and find an agreement. But it is not so. On the sacred elements, there are very often no agreement. And on the symbolism part, there is always very often lack of agreement, as long as it's taken seriously. That's why one of those Hussites with Israeli sailor met in the bar, they could probably find common language and talk about life. But the moment one is fighting for his interests and the other for his country's interests, this is when they likely will have to fight and will not find common language easily. This is to blame on the early 90s when everybody proclaimed that liberal democracy had won, Soviet Union fell apart because of their efforts, as they thought. And we forced everybody to believe, especially Ukrainian people, Ukrainian politicians, believed that there'll be no war. And European politicians believed that there'll be no wars, despite Yugoslavia, Kosovo, a conflict with 100,000 victims. I'm not even talking about Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan. But we won't have war in Europe, right? Everybody thought so. So the war will be, and not one, there'll be many. This current cycle of wars will likely continue till about 2035, 2040, in my estimation. So I can, in quotes, congratulate all the listeners that our countries, our representatives, will be fighting for the next 10 to 20 years. Maybe in periods. There would not be probably one global war, but there will be a bunch of wars happening. So don't faint, and also don't say that you need to run and move somewhere rapidly. You don't know if there'll be a scarier or more dangerous war in a place where you move. So after 1945, all the people in Europe decided to freeze that situation in a fashion that in the United Nations, they adopted a law that anybody who declares war automatically becomes an aggressor. That's why we still in Ukraine have not declared war with Russia. And people are attacking Zelensky and Poroshenko that they're so cunning that they have not declared that. Well, guys, those who are attacking them, if they do so, they immediately will be automatically considered as an aggressor party and say goodbye to all the supplies and support from allies. The war, as a result, becomes wilder. So these days you cannot just throw a gauntlet and declare that if you don't do this, we'll go to war with you. Instead of this, everybody fights proxy wars. So not with their hands, but with private mercenary companies, with special forces. It's a whole branch of military specialty now. But the wars with somebody else's hands are usually dirty, because those hands are usually the hands of scoundrels and scumbags. And the war had become much wilder because it was pushed into the shadowy area, and that's where things become wilder. The flow of war becomes wilder, the understanding of war becomes less civilized. It still remains an instrument of politics, and I would say more that war exists always. It's just there are some open wars and some concealed wars, hidden wars. So Geneva Convention, with limitation of different arms, limitation of certain uses and certain practices in war, this was the result of wars being in the civilized judicial field as one of the tools for politics. That's when they could have been framed to a degree, humanized to a degree. Nobody wanted to dehumanize or completely annihilate the enemy. They were treating the enemies as somebody who can become your ally in the next decade. Because in politics, it is one of the main things. If you can turn your enemy into your friend, this is how you get A+ in the global arena. So all the shit that's happening around wars for dozens of years is due to the fact that war was pushed out. And it needs to be returned back into the light. And rehabilitation of war as a political measure is one of the main trends on the West now. They finally start to understand that, especially in Europe. Military, of course, always understood that, but they just didn't have a chance to speak up. And now the head of Central Command of France now can say and explain what are their troops doing there in the east from Romania to the Baltic countries. And the key calculation of Kremlin was that Europeans will be afraid to legalize war, that they'll be afraid to tell their electors that wars are normal, in quotes again, that they'll be afraid to tell them, their citizens and voters, that we need to be ready for losses and actual combat. And now they apparently are getting ready. So for us, this is a super golden chance. First, it means that we will not be blackmailed and given up to Russia. Second, we'll have more resources, and we probably will have additional European troops ready to fight. And Americans, of course, will be there too. They won't really jump off that bandwagon. That means that Russian troops who will be resisting, even standing on the borders with Finland and in the Baltic countries and everywhere, they'll have to keep some troops there. So it's a civilizational turn. It's the forces they will have to draft and hold there and not throw into the grinder in Ukraine. That means that Ukraine has a chance to jump out of the destiny of the gray zone that would be kept otherwise as a gray zone between NATO and Russia, because everybody in NATO understands that it's much easier to stop Russia with Ukraine than to stop Russia with forces of NATO. That means that future support of Ukraine is still in the plans of the West. And it's fantastic. We don't want Russia to win here, right? 100%. All right. I paid attention, Alexei, that phrase where he says that sovereignty, the world order based on the sovereignty of countries and international law. That implies that international or national sovereignty and international law are not values in themselves, right? Not so. They're still valuable, they're still values, but they are not sacred values that are unchangeable. Because sovereignty, by what it means, is the right to make your own decision, right? Earlier, a small country, let's say Luxembourg, with all my love to that, it was in the international law very equal to United States, right? In the previous world order, that is now out. But now there is a statement that a bigger country can change that with the right of force. And the thing is that normalization of war actually implies the use of force, and that one can change the borders and outline of countries relying on force. Sorry for the intervention there. So, how now small countries would feel if they're basically being told, and the head of French General Command is fixating it, that the borders can be reviewed, right? This is a very basic and material consequence. They can be reviewed via the mechanism of war. It has happened before, and it likely will happen again. Well, thank you. It was important, I think, to analyze this French statement, and I think after that we can go to Czech Republic. Czech Republic purchased about 800,000 artillery shells for Ukraine from different suppliers throughout the world and have activated relations of the Cold War times. And they found additional 800,000 that could be purchased and brought as well. This is an article in Wall Street Journal commenting on the current state. So this publication also says that the first chunk of 800,000 is already purchased, and in the next few weeks they will be delivered to Ukraine and will be used on the front, plus additional about the same amount available. And as the article says, he reactivated relations of the Cold War times. Could you go maybe in a little more details about that Cold War times relations? So it sounds to me like Czech Republic is basically going to all the allies of Russia in person and in a concealed manner buying out different artillery shells. Well, Nikolai, we should do no harm, right? So we should not be looking too deep into that practice. There definitely are some nuances there, but in general, this is 800 plus another similar chunk of artillery shells now available for Ukraine. The funniest part is that they were available all that time. So the situation had to escalate to absence of American aid and our loss of Avdeevka in order for Czech Republic to be able to find those 800,000 shells. And this is 1.5 times more than Europe could produce, actually 2.5 from 300,000. So it seems like they had to be pushed to a certain corner as far as the situation pushed them in order for them to start moving. So it shows that despite that Peter Pavel, president of Czech Republic, he's an ex-NATO commander, career military, him and Europe at large will still have a lot of awakening to do in regards to being proactive, because these actions in the shells market are reactive, right? It got really hard for Ukraine. Russia was still pushing, then they had to go and find them. These shells were there. They were available somewhere in 2022, right? One could have found them back then and sent to Ukraine. But apparently we had to bring the situation to the brink in order for it to unfold. And the principle of war is very simple. Always hit, never hit back. So you need to use the Boyd's circle in order to, Boyd's maneuver in order to win over your opponent. For example, France now is using that maneuver essentially. So Macron comes in, kicks the door, and throws his troops to the border with Russia and says, hey, we're ready. So that's what really now has to reduce the level of bluff on the Putin side, because he's really out of cards now. What can he use to scare the public opinion of France when they're coming out and saying, yes, we're ready to? Minister of Defense, leaders of parliament. French people listened to that and said, okay, I guess we'll have to fight now. So it's hard to blackmail them now. If they were still mumbling and saying, yes, we're still for peace, let's maybe talk to Putin, let's review his ultimatum, perhaps we can satisfy him in some fashion, then Putin's actions on the Baltic side could have meant a lot more. So France has changed that, upended the strategy, and now Putin will have to look for new ways. And I would say that in order for us to win, we need to continue making these Boyd maneuvers over and over again, so that these 1.5 million artillery shells would be found not when we are in retreat mode from the current positions and withdrawing to form new front line, but when we were doing the counteroffensive maneuver. Because I'm quite sure that back in the day, when the counteroffensive campaign was in its peak, these shells were just as available. So there's, what I'm saying is there's a lot more room for improvement into the zone of being more proactive. Alexei, I remember your previous streams, and even before that, you announced the concept, or you're explaining, that the West behaves itself with Russia in a certain fashion. There is a certain behind-the-scenes demand being given to Russia and some space for it to make a decision and to stop. Russia fails to read it, fails to stop, whether it's a red line of Avdeevka or perhaps a statement that there'll be troops near Finland or some other red lines, and then additional trump card is being presented to the table, which supposedly was there, it just was never presented to the table at the time. Is it continuation of the same concept? Yes, Nikolai, it generally is. We need to become more proactive, and our allies as well, because Lindsey Graham in Kiev today mentioned that you might get those ATACMS to destroy the Crimean bridge. So where does this theme come from? Because gliding bombs that Russia is using is now a war-changing weapon. We do not have much to counter that with, and they're starting to look for equivalent. So they're keeping this situation somewhat in parity. And I'm saying that we need to stop doing that. We need to be more proactive when we get capabilities faster and have a higher quality than what Russian Federation can provide to the front. This is the strategy for us to win, and I sincerely hope that there'll be time when they will finally grow up to that understanding, and then they can either help us to fight more effectively or join us, and that becomes makes us then not partners but real allies, and that'll be a whole other story. So I'm wishing them to be more proactive. One miracle that God has already made: they decided not to surrender So now I'm asking for the second one, become a little more proactive, not to wait for Russia to start using something on us and then for our allies to scratch their heads for another 6 months before finding something to counter that with. This is not how wars are won. So is there a way to win the war? And I think you mentioned that several times, that studying different schools of analytics on the West, both liberal and the right, you were saying, or they were saying, that our future destiny is southern Vietnam. Is that so? Right. So the aspect is that it's southern Vietnam that needs to win. And the question is, what is still counted to be, what is perceived as victory? As I mentioned, nobody considers a full defeat of Russia on the battlefront as the possibility, and they don't want to get there. But they are talking about compromise, possibly from the position of force. And this is not a single scenario. If Russia indeed will start pushing, there could be a different option, a different outcome at the end as well. Say, destruction of Russian conventional army with the conventional means on the battlefront. And then there could be an ultimatum with other conditions. We will see where it goes, but at least the baseline consensus that is forming in the West after Macron's statements, we can talk about that, I think, is the compromise in force. And look, they're moving their troops in the daytime. They're moving their troops to the border on the east with us and with Russia in the daytime, with Belarus. They're showing that we are ready. We're ready to fight if we have to. This is a very serious factor that is changing Russian politics, and they cannot bluff their way out of it. And I'm suspecting that by 2025, there will be some kind of war with NATO. So if Russians would ask me today, for example, they at first were thinking about Ukraine. Oh, those Ukrainians will trample them in 3 days, will come there in white gloves and take the whole country. Now they understand that it's bloody nose and it's not so easy, but Europeans are definitely paper cats, paper tigers. So they'll probably deflate real fast and it will not be anything serious. So that's their school of politics. Let them try. I think they will realize to understand that they'll come to understanding that they're wrong, because EU is 4,000 jets of a newest generation. So, Alexei, NATO troops are already in Ukraine. They control the equipment donated to Ukrainian military, and they also do training and providing intel services. This is Spanish LP published with reference to their own sources. That sounds very loud, NATO troops. Nikolai, I would say, let's ask, what can we consider to be a troop, right? At least a brigade. I was traveling throughout Ukraine and I haven't seen a single NATO brigade here. So maybe we have 20 specialists across the whole country who are coming there on rotation basis to help our military specialists understand how certain howitzers and some artillery systems work. I can understand that because modern equipment is complex and it takes some training. You can do that overseas as well, but technical support, analysis, bettering the use, training, right? Like somebody said, we could never deny that there are certain narrow field specialists solving certain questions, but they definitely are not enough to be called troops, because troop is at least a brigade, right? Preferably more. Okay, Alexei, so that phrase about them controlling equipment supplied to Ukrainian military, what do you think that implies? Well, define, Nikolai, how do you want to control that? Our troops are using Caesar from France, for example, and or something from any other NATO country, and they're standing nearby with a notepad and taking notes? How? Yeah, control is an interesting word. How are they controlling? They seal the cabins so you cannot use Caesar from midnight till 6 in the morning, or show me where you're shooting, right? What does it imply, control? That's an interesting angle. Yeah, like, see, me as a civilian, I would draw myself a picture that there is some centralized command, but there is some electronic tracking of how and what and where. No, Nikolai, it's all much more prosaic. There probably is some specialist coming over to the troops, to their ticket, saying, hey, something doesn't work, checks the equipment, says, well, that thing needs to be refitted or soldered, some transistor went out and you need to fix it. And if he's asked why that was not provided as an information package, he would say, well, we didn't know that that exact thing would break. And also, we've been training you in a really quick mode, so not so deep in. Anyway, okay, good. What do you think they imply about Intel services that they can be providing? I don't know, Nikolai, what other scary Intel operations can they be providing on the territory of Ukraine if 2/3 of NATO Intel capabilities is already engaged on the border with Russia. And they're doing the research and monitoring of everything, aerial and everything else, and space. So you can actually check the flights that they publish of NATO Intel Aviation. They show a very detailed contour, what they see and how far they see. What other scary Intel operations can they be doing, right? Radio technical Intel, they have capability to do that even without being on the territory of our country. They don't need to do agent Intel from within Ukraine as well. What else? Open, again, yeah, you don't need to, you can use a lot of data from the open sources. So they don't need to be physically in Ukraine to conduct all the Intel operations. So in your view, these publications like that El País, what do you think they're doing? Well, here I think Spanish Minister of Defense came out and said after Macron that Spanish troops will not go to Ukraine. They don't need that. I think as a journalist you can understand that. They're spinning the information topic and they're discussing it. And oh, France is going, then why should we go? And there are troops in Ukraine. Well, again, these troops could be probably 5 specialists who had 1 foot on one side of the border, 1 foot on the other. But it's a hot topic and journalists are digesting it, so everything is working. Okay, thank you. And next one. Germany got some data about Russian capability to attack NATO starting 2026. German Special Services prepared an analysis report for their government that says that since 2026 there is a real risk that Putin's Russia may attack NATO territory. So look, previously they had a prognosis of 5 to 7 years. You said that they will never get that long. They'll get maybe 5 to 7 months. And now that prognosis moves to a much narrower window than 5 to 7 years. It's now 2026, right? So 2 years. Right, Nikolai. They're voicing one of the scenarios. And they're basically mirroring what Putin has said, that he thinks he will wrap up his Ukraine operation by 2025, the end of 2025. So I don't think anybody will give them that time. Because right now, Europe is actually ramping up their military production, they're drafting more personnel, so they're preparing for war. And what, do you think Russia will be just standing by and waiting for them to spin up their military potential to the higher degree? They likely will attack them, while Europe is not on the peak of its military form. In 2026, Europe will be likely in a very good shape. So that's why I'm saying that first hot time would be in June, then it will be hot period at the end of summer, and then probably November of this year till February of 25. And these 3 windows are probably more realistic for interesting activities by Russia than 2026. And I'm thinking 2026, of course, is a probability, but I'm thinking there'll be opportunities before that. What I think they're doing with this article, they're opening the Overton window, because if all of a sudden Russia does something in early 25 in the Baltic countries, Europeans might be very surprised. And now they're saying, well, it'll be 26, then they might bring it down to 25, and then eventually they may say that, well, it probably will be 25 early on, and just prepare their population to possible conflict in a shorter time frame. All right, Alexei, let's work in a different framework. In this war, during the first 2 years of its fighting, different game-changing events happened, starting with radio-electronic warfare, different UAVs, naval UAVs, a lot of organizational know-hows were realized. In your view, with such a huge war theater as we have in Ukraine, with these different threats on different theaters, how much do you think it is possible to prognosticate that? Is it even probable for analysts to analyze it effectively? Of course, Nikolai, everything can be analyzed pretty well. Out of the real game changers, there are probably drones and UAVs, right? And they did not change or cancel the war's logic, because the laws of war, they've been the same since Xerxes' times to the present. And I think when the robots in the future will be fighting the fight, they'll likely be the same laws. The war still looks very much like the Second World War. Not much has changed. It's just we have more long-range means to hit the enemy further. And UAVs, of course, brought a new aspect to it. And they're universal because they do intel and they do damage as well. So they have that closed loop, detect and attack, the dream of any military. But speaking at large, they have not changed the war overall. They just provided another angle, another aspect to it. Because you still need a lot of conscripts, you still need a lot of people, you still need large battalions to win. Drones are only just one element of it. And 4,000 of European jets is a very bad prognosis for Russian army, just in case. And that's just European, not counting American. So speaking of drones, this week there was a statement. In Ukraine, there is a specialist on radio electronic warfare, Sergei Flesh. He gave an interview on the TV marathon, and a lot of Telegram channels picked it up, picked a piece from this interview. He is sure that in 5 months, Russia will have an FPV drone to hunt basically every Ukrainian fighter. I think, Alexei, this is either a wrong statement, an erroneous statement, or maybe it was pulled out of the context. Just like they do with us, right? Except for with you and me, they sometimes pull it with some evil intentions, but in this case, they just pulled something that's flashy. Okay, Russia may have 500,000 drones, but do they have 500,000 operators? Plus the use in the military conditions, that's difficult. One drone per each fighter, that means that 600 Russian drone operators would have to be at the controls, getting their drones up and starting to chase every single Ukrainian soldier on the field. That doesn't happen. There is one sign that is usually being taught in a good military schools, usually on the first year of it, when good colonels that are teaching you on the first year, not the relaxed ones as you get on the fourth, they're saying, guys, the moment you see anywhere that people are talking about technical advantages or technical tools or more equipment, just that's a good sign for you that this likely indicates the failure of organization. We have in Ukraine a lot of non-professional military fighting the war. And the ones that are professional very often are not fully or well prepared. So very often we fall into that pit of we need better and more robust equipment. And equipment is, of course, important. Even Taras Shmut, with all his areas of knowledge and experience, that person is in his place, he's doing a lot of good work. But they tore a phrase out of context with him when he said that anti-tank missiles are not so important, drones are much better. But one can understand that radio electronic warfare will down the drone, but will not down the anti-tank missile. So you can pull things out of context easily. But for me, it's very simple in this case. The moment I see them going too deep into technical details, it means that the organization is failing. And drones are just one element of striking the enemy, of attacking the enemy. And the army is always an orchestra. It's always a complex of many different things. Remember how people were laughing at the Soviet system and saying that special forces tactics is way better? Well, 200 special force agents storming one grandpa with Kalashnikov, that's one special force situation. And that's called a special scary war in Afghanistan or Iraq. And they were chastising Soviet Union that it did not understand much about wars, and Soviet ground troops were not well prepared. But when the large war came over, it turned out that the Soviet Union was much better prepared for large warfare. The whole system of preparation, mobilization was fine-tuned to large-scale warfare. And the closer you get to Soviet samples, the better it turns out for the fighting party in the current war. And I'm bringing here some examples to show the specifics. Some people are laughing that Soviet troops were taught to attack in a large chain when you get off the vehicles, 600 yards in front of the enemy positions, and now people are laughing, saying that they won't even get that close to our trenches, we'll kill them all on that distance. We ride armored vehicles directly to enemies' entrenchments, jump out and defeat them all there. And the Soviets have never understood that. Well, yeah, Soviets were so dumb, except for they really understood the situation. They're forgetting now that in Soviet times, in Soviet doctrine, there were not 3 armored vehicles fighting with maybe a couple platoons in there. That the other style of Soviet-style warfare allowed them to dismount from their armored vehicles 600 yards before the enemy positions, because over the previous couple of days, that position was grinded by a huge wall of artillery into nothing, and they could dismount that far away and easily walk to these positions. There was nobody left there. When your whole concept implies that you should be attacking the enemy up to 250 kilometers depth and really grinding them down in 120 kilometer distance, then detachments and what you do is a bit different. We, of course, need better radio electronic warfare, better equipment, but this is only a small fraction of a bigger complex, of a bigger orchestra. And the one who has a better orchestra usually wins. Equipment definitely matters. Equipment defines your tactical and maybe operative maneuvers, but it is not the decisive factor. The main decisive factor is knowledge how to organize and use your troops at large. And we need big organizational forms that allow us to self-train our troops, that would allow them to grow. Because if you create a division and an army level detachments in Ukraine, it will be not so good initially, but look at them about a year from now and it will be a whole different story. So that's what I'm more interested. That's where my attention is, not so much on the new technical means. They're good, but they're not the main factor. Like, look what our battalion commanders tell from the front. They need to buy radio electronic equipment. They do not have that supported and provided from the government. Then they have to monitor certain websites to learn about the better systems. They spend dozens of hours doing the research. And then they need to send people who are usually making purchases of UAVs to send them to some location where these systems are being built. In one place, there apparently would be deceitful information, not so good. They'll eventually find one place where somebody is already making them well. They'll have to somehow get in line, get maybe 3 of them, get them over to the front. Turns out that on the front, the Russians already changed their frequencies, so that radio electronic system is out of date. And then you need to change the transistors and some other stuff there in the frequencies. And here's the thing, that the battalion commander should not be a specialist in that type of warfare. There should be a system that allows our government to track that, to provide right tools. It shouldn't be on the individual officers. Instead, we're using a system where we're trying to solve it en masse. And it may be a benefit sometimes, but we're lacking a lot of organizational efforts that can turn us into a better functioning army. And that horror that is now being discussed in our Rada in Congress, that recent suggestion was to punish the commander for giving order that his troops can vote a non-confidence scenario on their commander. My hair is rising on my head because that's so wrong. Our army is already semi-Makhno style army, semi-anarchy structure. And people now pushing these laws, they don't understand that the army fights in a fashion that their officers know how to fight. And I'm exaggerating here, but Ukrainian officers are often brought up in a slave mode. They are trained to be more afraid of responsibility in front of their motherland, in front of the country. And officers need to be reinforced with the real rights. They need to be brought up as people of honor, duty, and professionalism, not to be afraid of their personnel. And now we are apparently trying to send our semi-anarchistic war system into some volunteer thing when troops can vote in or vote out their commander. If they do that, I would say, yeah, the last one, please turn the light off. After that, that'll be nothing more. We made a big step in the right direction with our early initiatives in the army, but with this law that I'm reviewing now, I have a question. Do you have anybody in your Congress that, not special forces, but somebody from real army that could consult you? Not many people talk about that, but special forces is basically a graveyard for the officers. They are not well trained in a large-scale warfare. And those lieutenant colonels that guide small attack groups, that's a dead end of the military evolution. It should be commanded by a sergeant on a large front. And then I literally have some acquaintances who are fighting in special forces since 2014 reaching out to me now and saying that, hey, where can we read up a bit on the large-scale warfare? Because we are not exactly trained to do that. We're better at intel, at planting explosives on certain targets or taking out certain patrols, but we're not about orchestrated large-scale warfare. So we have Syrsky as the commander-in-chief now, right? And we're waiting for reforms of a military system. And I was calling to troops and talking to friends asking, hey guys, any notable changes? Yes, they say. They started fortifying the roads near the front. This is important because that's where a lot of vehicles get damaged, right? So now they start to add more stones to this road, more gravel, so they would be less heavy on the vehicles and equipment. And I don't know if that was an order by Syrsky or somebody else, but that's a good point. But unfortunately, there is not any other single thing that would be noteworthy. And I'm not seeing these loud appointments leading to any significant changes, even though we've been talking about some changes for a while now that need to be done. And instead we have president coming out and saying, we have done another consultation with the heads of all the offices and the central command, and we have a lot of tasks that we need to tackle, but I'm looking at the actual tasks and they're not being solved. They're still pending. Mobilization, training, and use. They're being solved partially, right? So recently we discussed in the last stream, there was a good law, good bill. Still not sure about the final destiny of it. But besides that, there are a lot of trends that just cause a pause and a quite big question mark. To make commanders responsible in face of their troops for the decisions they make, this is the end of the army. The commander already in the Ukrainian army is somewhat afraid of his superior commander. But you want them now to be afraid of their personnel too? And I understand somebody may say that we have some butchers among commanders, but there should be other systems dealing with that, not by voting them out. Okay, Alexei, so what should be done? How do you see it done proper? Oh, it's very simple, Nikolai. We need to implement the system of military justice, which we're still failing to implement, when professionals can review the real mistakes and come to real conclusions. Because our investigative committee with the government, they're not ready to do that. Because when they come to investigate events with the army, they basically come and ask, in your order, it says platoon goes there and company goes there. What is bigger, platoon or company? And the officers, the colonels that they investigate would look down on them and say, hey, go study the books. Do your basics and then come to investigate me. I have no time teaching you. So that's what I'm saying. Military system needs its own military justice. And we do have laws. We do have laws that enforce the military system, our regulations and rules there. They have to be implemented. And we also need to implement a system of lessons learned, right? So these two measures can change things a lot on the front if they're taken right. So that we can affect commanders who are butchers and not let them grow, and allow the others who are better at making right decisions to grow into those positions. And unfortunately, we do not have that system. Very often, we end up appointing friends, brothers, relatives, so some shape of nepotism when you appoint your nephews to the key positions around you. This is not the right approach. There are even better things we can do, but at least if we chase these two targets, that'll be fantastic. And then later we have to change, of course, the training things, so in the training academies and preparation of the officers, but without after-action reviews and without military justice, that's difficult. We won't even get to those points. And frankly, you need each officer and each sergeant is one of a kind. You need to really spend resource to make sure they're well trained. Ultimately, you need to train each soldier like that, but at least start with the commanding group. And of course, UAVs, FPVs are important, but it's about the commander who is using them. That's the key factor. And Butusov, our war correspondent, recently wrote about commanders of battalions who are sitting and commanding the individual UAVs on the front. This is wrong. It's a task for a platoon commander, or maybe a specialist in there, not for the commanding officer. But that's how they fight, because they bear personal responsibilities. And that's where all these fights for the groves and straightening the front lines, unexplainable maneuvers why that battalion commander cannot explain to his superior why. Because it's easier for him to comply than to explain that it doesn't make sense to take it. It's better to let our enemy take that grove and organize the fire pit and fire trap for them there. But that's where you need more professionalism, to be able to counter, not too smart of a command, and also to organize a better response. And this is a very painful topic. Our military is not training properly. I do not see any significant changes, but I do see some very dangerous trends. And that initiative in the committee at Congress about the vote of no confidence to the superior officer, this is not turn the lights off, but that's halfway there. This is a complete foobar, Nikolai. Let me bring up a medical example, a medical analogy for that, because military nuance may be too difficult for people. Imagine that your surgeon that is doing your surgery is now facing a rule that everybody who's providing and assisting him can vote a no confidence during the surgery. So they can organize a discussion and vote him out. And he will have to think now if the nurse will like him for him barking at her for being too slow or making a mistake. So that's a similar story. Or another equivalent would be, let's vote a no confidence to the pilot of the plane, right? That passengers or stewardess can deliver a vote of no confidence and remove the pilot. Or to the captain of a ship that's guiding a ship through the storm. I thought we'll see different things, but I was never thinking that we'll find a practice from 1917 of toying with personnel. And you know what's another murderous element of this? Is the no confidence vote plus removal of criminal responsibility from soldiers if they refuse to execute an executable order. But who can determine if the order is not executable? Who can define that? Any order can be determined to be unexecutable. And a soldier can come out and say, well, I was reading the book on tactics, we need to have an advantage of 1 to 6 or 1 to 12 in city conditions. Or on the main tip of efforts, we need to be 1 to 12 advantage. And now we're only at 1 to 6, so I'm not going to execute this order. Is that the discussion we want to have? And you can find a regulation from military laws where a commander bears full responsibility for organization of his actions, organization of his troops. That article was not removed. It's still there. So if military justice system is there, he can be prosecuted for it. But that vote of no confidence just shows that our current congressmen are so far from understanding the processes in the army that it's very concerning. And that's in the committee that is dealing with military law. So these attempts to toy with public votes, to try to be liked by soldiers and members of their families, the thought that this will somehow limit butchers, this is wrong. Of course we need to limit butchers, but it is done by other measures, not by destroying the principle of single command, the principle of unity of the army. Because that's the only thing that differs army from the crowd of armed people, even if they have nukes or HIMARS. It's the unity and single-threaded leadership. Every soldier has only one commander at any single time, and that commander bears full responsibility on that soldier. And the orders are not argued about. At first you attempt to execute them, and then you can later bring it up with military justice if something wrong is with it. And here it is unexecutable order that you can make a judgment on that. Imagine you're in training, somebody tells you you need to march and lift your leg higher, you lift your foot higher, and you can say, well, no, I cannot. This is unexecutable order. Idiots, I'm sending a message to Congress. Please stop it. Okay, I need to clarify here, Alexei, maybe I'm wrong, remembering it, but I think that norm about vote of no confidence was also discussed about Israeli army. Is it different there? No, they never have vote of no confidence. In Israeli army, everything is rather strict. There are a lot of legends about it that are lying about many things. That, for example, Israeli soldier, if captured, needs to be able to tell everything to survive. No, he can only say his name, his number, and detachment. And if he spills more and talks more, he'll be prosecuted. And there are examples in real life about that. So every action that turns an army from organization that is very discipline-based and personal responsibility-based and turns it into more anarchic structure, it's a murder of the army and it's a murder of your country, especially when the army is holding the enemy's invasion. This is the most anti-government action one can take. But let's say this. Andrei Borisovich, I know you will see that clip. I know people will show you. Would you like to take a good professional military officer to the office of the president who will be explaining how it works both to you and the president? Because whoever is advising you now, it will destroy the army, it will destroy the country, and it will destroy you personally. Let me clarify more here, Alexei. That system of military justice. One, if to lead it, organize it, and practically implement it, you do not need too many people, or we do not have too many people who are capable to do that. Well, no, Nikolai, we have these people. We have military police, actually. They just need to get enough rights. They're very limited in what they can do. Second, we have departments that could become military DA, military prosecutor's office, that was destroyed. We can restore that. There are a lot of military who've resigned, who remember all these things, who remember all regulations, who can organize it. And there'll be a good overview for commanders so they don't spare their soldiers without thinking. Because I understand there is a real problem with unprofessional commanders, with some of them having proclivity for sending their troops to a meat grinder. But we need a proper system to take care of it. And it needs to be not just a civilian prosecutor. It's got to be a special military prosecutor who'll be doing that, who'll be leading that system. And they have to have proper personnel from all the way up to all the way down, and the system of after-action review. Only then it will work, where you can create proper, direct personnel conclusions based on the cases. And if the review shows the commander is failing, then he should be sent to a different place. He either gets training to get better, or his personnel career goes into a different direction. He is removed from commanding positions and he goes to engineering or command work, paperwork, because not everybody can be a commander, and not everybody can be a commander during a large-scale warfare. After the war, I'll give you some numbers, because there were done some studies about the professionalism level of battalion commanders and brigade commanders of armed forces in Ukraine. When I'll tell you what results did we see, you will be horrified. So I know the real numbers. That's why I'm saying we need to fix it. We need to fix it in practice, but with good measures. Those people who are standing, who are leading the military policies of our country, unfortunately still do not understand that path. And I can give them several names who understand and whom they should be listening to. But then I'm afraid there'll be more politics involved, because why should I be listening to that person? And that's why we have more troops dying, taking certain groves that are completely unnecessary, because of the lack of commander skills that need to be trained. And we need to be doing it during the war. Some people are saying, no, you cannot do it during war, you cannot train them. Exactly, that's when you need to train them. Because your defense systems need to be trained and bettered day after day. Because the main defense weapon one can have is the head on your shoulders. Okay, and that's a good time, Alexei, that we should announce that we do support the armed forces of Ukraine. And under this stream, we are gathering money for a very important fundraiser, and if you can, please join us. It's a 3rd Storm Brigade, Yes, Nikolai, it's a 3rd Storm Brigade, and we're gathering money for the mortar battery in it. Alexei, yes, you're absolutely correct. I fumbled that. Right, and Nikolai, using this opportunity, I want to say hello to that Storm Brigade, where commanders like to say that Arestovich is so bad. So I hope we gather enough money for your vehicle for transport and it won't burn your butts while using it. And if you need more support, come over. We'll be glad to help you out. Right, this is not the first fundraiser, right, Alexei? Yeah, exactly. It's not the first fundraiser. We're just using this opportunity. And I know that you dislike Arestovich. Arestovich is bad, but we're always ready to help and provide you more funds for your equipment. Please do not forget to click the like button, share, and subscribe.